Okay. Well, thanks for asking us to join you tonight. I want to try and make this as much of a discussion as possible rather than a lecture. So I will be asking you questions, and you can use the text box to reply. And I think I've seen Roxy's on as well. So Roxy, you can shout out any questions that land in there. Don't be afraid to shout out if you've got a question as we go along. And on some of the slides, if you hover your mouse at the top of the screen, you'll get this bar arrives, and if you click the annotate button, then you can add text or draw or put ticks and crosses on the screen, so that might be useful later on. So you'll get a chance to add stuff as we go along. But we're going to start off and look at sheep worms. So first thing to do then is to see the screen to move. We're going to have a look at which worms are a problem, and then we'll have a quick look at when do they happen, because we don't get all the worms all the time. And then we'll see when is it a problem and which animals in particular do we get a problem with. And then we'll have a discussion on how we're going to manage this, how best to manage worms, and that'll bring in the wormers and the wormer resistance that we're looking at. And then we'll decide on what we're going to do next. Okay, so that's the plan for the evening. So if we start with which worms, so this is a big table, and this is just really to explain to you that there are lots of different worms in sheep. Okay, and we get some in the stomach and some in the small intestine, and some in the large intestine. But really there are 4 different species or 4 groups that are the main ones that cause 99% of the problems. And these are the ones in red. So we've got Nematodiris as a key one. We've got the trikes, so Trichostrongylus, Axii, Colubriformis, and Vitrinus. We just call them the trikes. We've got Haemonchus, and we've got Telodosacea, which is in the stomach. Haemonchus is a bit different because it's a bloodsucker, and so it gives you different clinical signs. It doesn't really cause sheep to scour. It causes anemia, so you get signs a bit more like liver fluke. And if you get this on the farm, it can be a real problem. It will kill adult sheep as well. Okay, so that's really what we're dealing with. We're going to concentrate on these 4 as the 4 main worms. And just so that we're all kind of starting on the same page, we'll have a quick look at the basic roundworm life cycle. We're just going to focus on roundworms today on the sheep because tapeworms don't really cause much of a problem. When you get tapeworms in sheep, they're not really a big issue. So we can answer questions on tapeworms later, but we're really going to focus on roundworms because they're the ones that cause the real issues. So the average roundworm in sheep is going to have most of its life cycle outside on the pasture and a small part inside the sheep. So it can be anything between 3 and 12 weeks on the pasture, depending on the temperature and moisture levels. And that's the time it takes for the eggs to hatch, go through a few larval development stages to the 3rd stage larvae, which is then infectious to the sheep. Once the sheep eats these, it takes between 2 and 3 weeks for those worms to become adults and start producing eggs again. So that's your pre-patent period of about 3 weeks. And the 4 worms that we're most interested in, the 4 ones that cause 99% of the damage, all kind of stick to that basic life cycle. Nematodiris is a little bit different because it tends to do 1 life cycle a year. It'll develop to the 3rd larval stage inside the egg and then sit there and wait until it's had a period of chilling so through the winter, and then hatch in the springtime when the weather warms up. So Nematodirus is a little bit different for that reason. And you don't really need to know much more about it than that, just that they need that time on the pasture and then about 3 weeks inside the animal before they're producing eggs again. So when do they happen? We've got the months of the year along the bottom there. And the worm that we tend to see first in the grazing season is Nematodirus. And this is because most of those eggs will lie dormant until they've had that period of chill. And then as the weather warms up, we'll get this mass hatch. So all the eggs that have been accumulating on the pasture since last summer will hatch at more or less the same time. And that's why Nematodirus can cause such severe damage in lambs that haven't met it before. It's not that they're meeting one or two at a time, it's that they suddenly get challenged by thousands of worms at the same time. And the immature stages of Nematodirus can do so much damage that they can kill the lambs before they even show any signs of illness. So that's the problem when you get a mass hatch with Nematodirus. And we have to remember that these are the immature worms, so you're not going to get any eggs if we're looking at worm egg counts for Nematodirus. So we need to think of other ways of checking to see when Nematodirus is coming. The next one we tend to get is the grey line, which is Telar Drossasia. So that will happen any time once the weather warms up a bit. And it usually works alongside Trichostrongylus, which tends to happen a bit later in the year. But you usually get mixed infections of these. And these are the ones that classically give you that scour in your lambs, that parasitic gastroenteritis. And then we have Haemonchus, which I said is the bloodsucker. And that can pretty much happen any time during warm weather. It doesn't like the cold, which is why it's not that common as far north as we are. But the weather is changing and the worm habits are changing. And we are starting to see Haemonchus more regularly in the north of England and in Scotland as well. So those are the four main worms, and broadly speaking, when they happen. Now we have to remember that they're not looking at the calendar months. They're just going on what the weather's doing. So if we have a cold spring, everything's going to be pushed further down the year. If we have a dry summer, worm development on pasture will stop. And you won't get any worm activity until we start to get warm and wet happening in the autumn. So we did see that over the last few years. When we've had dry summers, we've had little or no worm activity in June, July, when you'd expect to need to worm your lambs. There's been no worms there at all. Even into August last year, we didn't see much worm activity at all. So we've got to remember that the worms are changing their habits as the weather patterns change. And we're sometimes seeing a second peak of Nematodirus in the autumn. And these are Nematodirus eggs that have been deposited on the pasture in the spring and then decided to hatch without being chilled. Okay, so that's Nematodirus changing its habits a little bit. And that can cause, problems in lambs in the autumn that haven't had exposure to Nematodirus in the spring. So does that make sense? That's everybody happy with what we're dealing with? That we've got several different species of worms, four main ones that cause all the problems, and they're all a wee bit different. Yep, everyone happy with that? Okay, I can't see who's on and your reactions when I've got this presenting. So feel free to shout at me if just to let me know you're still there. So that's when they happen. Next, we want to start to look at when is it a problem and which animals are we going to have a problem in. So this is where I want you to start joining in a bit. So if you go up to your menu bar at the top, I don't know how well this works on smartphones. I saw there's a few iPhones joining in there. I think you can still use the annotate button. So hover your mouse at the top, look for the annotate button, and go to the stamp, and then choose the ticks and crosses. And if you can put a tick or a cross next to the group of animals that you think are most likely to have problems with worms. So we've got some youngish lambs in this box, and we've got some fairly fit looking yows in that one. So just give us a tick next to the lambs if you think they're the main issue, or a tick next to these ewes pre-tupping if you think they're going to be the issue. We'll see how many folk are still awake. Right, we've got a couple. We've got somebody saying two people saying the ewes are the issue. We've got a few on the lambs, a few more on the lambs. That's good. So I'm seeing quite a lot of people are ticking the ewes as being an issue for worms, and a few people ticking the lambs. So I'm just going to clear that for all the drawings. And while you're on that, can you just stick a number? Can you put numbers on? No, just give me if you go into the stamp and then a cross, put a cross on for every time you think you're going to worm the lambs or worm the ewes each year. So if you think you're going to worm the lambs twice, give me 2 crosses there. If you think you're going to worm the yows twice, give me 2 crosses there. Right, that's good. Oh, I've got a question mark from Liz. That's good. Somebody's using the Lottie's gone for the line drawing, which is much more difficult. If you use the button next to that which says stamp, you can get ticks and crosses. Okay, that's quite interesting. So we've got about equal thinking that we need to worm the lambs about the same, maybe slightly more than we need to worm the yows. Would you? Okay, so that's where we think we are on that one. All right, I'll clear those and we'll go on to the next one. Okay, now the thing with sheep is they're really good at developing immunity to worms. I know I said that Haemonchus can actually kill adult sheep, but that's because they don't see it very often. So it takes them a while to develop their immunity and regain their protection. On the whole, after sheep have had a full grazing season, they're pretty much immune to worms as long as they're in good body condition and not under too much stress. So really, when you get sheep to this stage, good condition, pre-tupping, they probably don't need worming. Their immune system will be firing on all cylinders and they'll have their worm burden pretty much under control. The lambs, on the other hand, haven't seen enough worms to develop immunity yet. So these are the ones that really need our help. These are the ones that do need worming, if not regularly, at least sometimes through the summer and the first grazing season, to make sure the worm burden doesn't get high enough to hold them back. So what we're aiming to do with these guys, let me see if I can get back on there, is for the lambs, we've got to control that level of worm challenge enough to prevent disease, but still allow enough exposure to these worms so that these animals will develop immunity so they don't need to be wormed when they're bigger. And I say mostly the adult sheep don't need to be wormed. There are occasions when they might, and that's especially around lambing time when they're putting so much of their time and energy into growing a lamb and producing milk that they might not have enough energy left to maintain their immune response. So sometimes at lambing time, some of the ewes in the group will need to be wormed. And we'll come on to how we decide on which ones to treat a bit later. Anybody want to challenge that? You know, I'm saying here that I've seen you've quite a few of you put stickers on to say that we should be thinking about worming ewes. And I'm sitting here saying, actually, most of the time you don't need to. Okay, we'll take that silence as agreement for now. So when we're talking about lambs, we've said that we need to think about worming them. And this is some work that was done quite a long time ago, looking at what impact worms have on lambs as they grow. So this was a research centre, and they had some lambs, which is the blue line, that they gave no worms to, and then 3 other groups that they gave either 1,000, 3,000 or 5,000 worms to. And you can see the impact that had on the growth rate. None of these challenges was enough to make the lambs look obviously ill. So these weren't scouring, they weren't looking ill at all, they looked perfectly happy, but that level of worm challenge halved their growth rate without them looking ill at all. Okay, so this is a really kind of important thing to remember when we're thinking about worming lambs, is if we want our lambs to keep growing, we can't wait until they look ill to think about worming them. If we wait till they look ill, we've lost all this potential growth rate already. So if we go back to when the worms become a problem, for the lambs, just clear all those again. For lambs, we actually want a low level of worm challenge. That may seem counterintuitive, but we do want that low level of worm challenge so that these guys can develop immunity, and then we don't need to worry about worm control later on in life. What we can't afford is to have anything other than a very low level of challenge. If we get into this medium layer, we're losing performance, but we can't see it. Okay, so this is hidden loss. In the green zone, they're growing fine. Once you get in the blue zone, they're not growing as well as they could be. It's a hidden loss. And if you wait until you can see that there's a problem, then they've probably stopped growing, or they might even be losing weight. So by the time you see them looking a bit steri-coated or even scouring, then you know we're really a bit late on it, and we should have been thinking about treating them earlier. So that's when worms become an issue for lambs. So what we're going to think about when we're managing worms then. What are you currently doing? What's your current routine? And if we're just talking about lambs here, you can use the text box or you can shout out. Somebody else will have to have a look at the text box for me because I can't see it. But tell me what you're currently doing. So we said the first worm to come along would be Nematidiris. Do you do anything specific for Nematidiris? Something in the chat. Oh. Okay, so we've got a few comments coming in. Looking at worm egg counts, when Nematidiris forecast recommends it, and then every 4 or 5 weeks after that. Now that's a really good way to go about it. usually begin worming. Oh, we've got half a comment there. So for Nematodiris, because we want to do something about that before we get adult worms there, the best way to look at that specifically is to think about looking at the Nematodiris forecast. And the SCOPS website hosts a Nematodiris forecast that's updated every day, which looks at weather station data and updates the forecast for the individual weather station areas. So it's a really good indicator of when you might be thinking about doing your Nematodiris dose. And yeah, this is somebody usually begin worming in June. So again, kind of set time, that might work. You might miss it, you might be too early, you might be a bit late even, depending on what the weather does. So the Nematodiris forecast is the best way to go about controlling Nematodiris. Worm egg counts, I think, are great because it lets you know exactly what's happening and it takes some of the guesswork out of it. Anything else you might want to do to manage worms for the sheep on the farm? Any other ideas? No. Yeah, rotate grazing. That's a good one. So sheep worms and cattle worms tend to be different. And if we can not keep sheep on the same ground all the time, if we can graze the sheep on it one half of the season and the cattle the next, then we get the sheep will eat the cattle worms and won't come to any harm, and vice versa. Moving sheep around field rotation regularly, that can help, but you've got to be a bit careful you don't go back to a field that lambs have been in with lambs, especially if they get a high worm egg count on that pasture. Be a bit careful not to go back to it with lambs that might still be susceptible to having problems. So when we talk about how best to manage worms, there are a few things, a few basic principles that we can consider. So number one would be avoiding the worms if you can. And this is particularly applies to things like Nematodiris, because it tends to do one life cycle a year. It goes from one lamb crop to the next. So if you can avoid putting lambs in the same pasture, in the same field where you had lambs at Nematodiris time last year, then you can pretty much cut out the Nematodiris risk. And I know that's not possible when you've got a lot of sheep and not much land, but it's something you can think about if you've got cattle and sheep or mixed farms. Number two is we really need to move away from worming at fixed times. So we've got to think about, let's just worm things when we need to. And that's because the weather's changing and the worms are changing their habits alongside the weather, which means that if we stick to traditional worming times and periods and don't adapt as the weather changes, we'll miss the boat. We'll either be worming when we don't need to, or we'll be leaving it too late and worming after the damage has been done. So worm only when you have to is the next kind of principle that we want to stick to. And then the next one, this might be a bit different than you've talked about before. Use as many different wormer groups as you can within the season, and avoid using the same one twice in a row. And we'll come on to what the wormer groups are in a minute. But previously, maybe a couple of decades ago, people talked about rotating wormers. So you'd use one year and then a different wormer group the next year. And we know now that that really doesn't make a lot of difference to how resistance develops, but by changing about and using different wormers within the same season does make a difference. So that's what we want to try and think about doing now. And then the key thing that we need to do is check to see how effective your treatments have been. So if you're going to take the time and effort to bring a batch of lambs in and treat them, you want to make sure that treatment's been effective. And there are a number of reasons why that treatment might not be as effective as it should be. And the most common is still not getting the dose right. So that's maybe because you're in a hurry and you haven't weighed the lambs, or you've made a guess because they're usually about 20 kilos at that time of year. Or maybe you haven't had time to calibrate the dosing gun and it's not been delivering the full dose that you thought it was. All of these things will make a worming treatment less effective than it should have been. And then we do have the risk of resistance to the wormers as well. And if we have resistance developing, then the resistant worms will be left behind after a worm has been given. So question there in the chat box, what do you think about the future of DNA testing for parasite resistance? So when I'm talking about resistance here, I'm talking about the ability of the worms to survive a wormer treatment. So the worms are resistant to the wormer. In the DNA testing for parasite resistance, let's call that immunity to parasites instead, so that we don't mix the two up. And yes, I think breeding for the ability to cope with worms in your sheep is a really good thing to be thinking about right now. I know there are people that have been doing it for quite a long time, and even just within 4 or 5 years, you can make a big difference by keeping the ewe lambs or the ram lambs that cope best with worms. It can make a big difference to your growth rates and to the amount of wormer you need to use to control worms. So that's the kind of key principles that we need to employ if we're going to manage worms well. And if we think about why do we want to avoid the parasite challenge, this is the second part of that study I showed you earlier. And the red line shows what happens when you take that moderate level of worm challenge. So again, this isn't enough worms to make the animals look ill. You take that level and you treat them. This was with a white drench at a time when white drenches were fully effective. And they were treated every 21 days so that these animals never got a positive worm egg count. But you can see from this that even regular treatments didn't get these animals back up to the level of performance you'd have had if you'd been able to avoid those worms in the first place. So this just shows that immature worms at any level, at anything other than a very low level, will have some impact on growth rates. So that if we can avoid the worms, or certainly avoid these moderate levels of challenge, we should do if we want our lambs to perform well. Other ways we can avoid the worm challenge. This is up on the west coast of Scotland, so we've got some fairly extensive grazing. The sheep only go on this bit once a year. They're there till they've eaten the grass off, and then they move on and they don't come back again. So this never really gets much of a worm egg. There's never many worms on this pasture because the sheep just aren't on there often enough to leave the worm eggs behind. We've already talked about co-grazing with cattle. So sheep on it for part of the year and then cattle on it for part of the year, and swap them round. And then we've also got to think about if we're finishing lambs in the autumn, do we really want to put those lambs back on the grass, on the ground that they've already grazed and potentially put a lot of worm eggs onto earlier in the season? So that's how we start thinking about alternative forages, or even some of these bioactive forages. And this is chicory and clover mix, but you can also use more traditional things like turnips or kale, just to get the lambs off the grass and finish them on something else. And because the ewes and the adult sheep have already developed resistant immunity to worms, they can safely go back onto the pastures that the lambs might have contaminated fairly heavily and utilize that grass quite well. So it's not a question of not using the grass, it's just making sure that you don't put young lambs on the same bit of ground frequently, where they might multiply up the worm burden to quite a high level. Worm when you have to. So we've talked a little bit about adult ewes being getting immunity to worms. When are people currently worming ewes? So just use the text box or write it on the screen again. Firstly, how often are you worming your ewes, and at what time of year do you think it's necessary? So I've got one at lambing, yep. Turnout at lambing, sorry, yeah, at lambing, just before tupping. And we've got another one that says tupping. Okay, I'll go back to what I said earlier. At tupping time, your ewes are probably in the fittest condition they're ever going to be for the year. Their immune system will be firing on all cylinders. They will 9 times out of 10 have their worm burden under control. For the vast majority of sheep, a worm dose at tupping time is a wasted dose. It's probably not going to do those sheep any good at all. And this is, you know, if you're not sure about that, it's a great opportunity to go and just speak to the vets, get them to help you pick up some dung samples from the right animals and see if there's any worms there. And if there's not, you don't need to spend your time on effort and money on worming them. Save that money for something else. 3 times a year for worming. So, you know, adult sheep, as I said, lambing time is probably the only time that we should really think about worming adult sheep, and probably not all of them if they're in good body condition. So at lambing time, we want to be worming the ewes that are going to put worm eggs out onto the pasture for the lambs to pick up later. And that's really the ones that are struggling to maintain body condition. So, you know, thin sheep, lame sheep, sheep carrying triplets, these are all going to be under stress and will probably need worming. The rest probably won't. But again, it's always better to check. So this is an ideal opportunity to pick up some dung samples and see if you actually need to worm them. You know, this is where we can save a bit of time and money. Yeah, treating for fluke is different, and this is make absolutely certain that we understand we're just talking about roundworms here. We're not talking about liver fluke, because that is a different beast entirely. But when it comes to worming things, worming adult sheep, probably don't need to do them other than at lambing time, or unless they're in, you know, if they've had a rough winter and they're thin, then thin sheep may well need some help. So if we think about the lambs now, when are we going to think about worming lambs? What's your current routine? Is anybody just going I'll just worm them whenever I catch them. We've got one in the chat box. So we've got, yep, I'll agree with Liz. Liz is saying when the worm egg count says so. We've got a couple have said maybe start in May and then every 3 or 4 weeks afterwards. Okay. What I would think about for lambs is if we wait till they look like they need it, you're too late. You've missed the boat. So if we think back to that graph, we're losing half the growth rate before you can see there's any problem there. So we don't want to wait until that point. If we think about doing it every month, I would say at least half of them, you'll be worming them when there's no worms there. So I wouldn't do that either. What I would do is instead of doing routine treatments every month, I would do a routine mob sample and see if they need worming. And I know that's maybe different than what you're currently doing, but it's not that difficult once you get into the routine of doing it. And this is where a little bit of help and advice can make a big difference to both the time that you spend worming sheep and the money that you spend on sheep wormers and the results that you get for doing it. So, if it was me, I wouldn't be worming anything until I'd done a worm egg count to see what was there and if we actually needed to. Okay, Liz, yep, if we weigh regularly and the daily live weight gain drops, we should be thinking about worming without a worm egg count. Yep, and so my next one on here is what I call TST. Now this is targeted selective treatment. Have many of you got EID wake rates? I'd ask you to hold your hands up if I could see you, but I can't. So just stick it in the text box if you've got a wake rate that can check EIDs and record weights for you. Yeah, we've got a few. That's good. Now, you've got to put an EID tag in at some point, so you might as well make use of it. If you can stick an EID tag in, even at weaning time, and then every time you handle that batch, run them through the wake rate and record the weight, you can actually forget about doing worm egg counts and just worm them on growth rate. And that picks out the individuals in the group that need a wormer and leaves the ones that are coping well. So again, it'll help you select if you're breeding your own replacements. It'll help you pick the ones that you want to keep for breeding, because these are the ones that don't need worming so often. So when it comes to worming lambs, I would be looking at nematode iris. Yes, you need to go on the forecast. You need to look at the Scops website and think about worming those lambs when the forecast says you're going to get that hatch happening. After that, go on worm egg counts, because there's no point in worming them if there's no worms there. And then if you have got the technology and the capability to weigh the sheep regularly, then using a targeted selective treatment approach will reduce your time spent worming further and reduce your wormer costs further with no detriment to your growth rate at all. So you'll still maintain the same performance that you would have had if you'd wormed them every month without the wormer cost, without that drive to develop more resistance in the worms. Yeah, so that's a good thing to think about doing for the future if you're not already thinking about it now. We think about adult sheep and adult ewes. Ewes under nutritional stress at lambing, so anything that's thin or lame or carrying triplets, as we said. they probably do need some help. Fit, healthy adult ewe, carrying a single, probably doesn't need any help. So that's one thing. Other times for adult sheep, I would say probably not, unless you've got a worm egg count that says they've got a problem. So that's possibly quite a lot different than you're doing at the moment. And there's a good reason to think about changing. Well, a question popped out there about difference in daily live weight gain. We'll cover that off at the end when we talk, if we want to, we can go into the TST thing in a bit more detail. So it's quite a big change from what traditionally we've been doing for worming sheep, and there are good reasons behind it. Screen's frozen. So when we start talking about wormers, we've talked about avoiding the worms and only worming when we need to. We've then got to think about what wormers have we got and how we're going to use them. So we've got 5 different groups of wormers available for sheep now. We've got the group 1s, which are the white drenches, the BZs. They've been around since about the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. We've got the group 2 LVs. They've been around since the late 60s. The group 3 MLs, they appeared in the mid to late 1980s. And the group 4s and 5s were discovered about 7 or 8 years ago. Okay. And we've got levels of resistance to the first 3 groups. So we know there's resistance to these. We know we'll get resistance to the other 2, to the group 4 and the group 5, if we don't use them carefully. And I'll cover off why that happens in a sec. But just now, in the chat box, if I was to go out and test on 100 farms, how many of those 100 do you think I would find some level of resistance to white drenches? I'm not talking about complete treatment failures. I'm just talking about the wormer not being fully effective and maybe, leaving more worms behind than it should. So out of the 100 farms, how many do you think would have detectable white drench resistance? Okay, so yeah, that's fairly convincing. So that goes from 97% to all of them. And you're not far wrong at that. I think if we looked on most farms, we would find some level of resistance to white drenches in one or other of those worm species that we talked about earlier. We have to remember that each worm species will have a different resistance profile. If we move on to the yellows, on those same 100 farms, how many of them do you think we would find resistance to the yellows? So we've got 90. Any advance on 90? The yellows are a bit more variable, and depending on where you look, it might be as low as 25 or 30. It might be as high as 75. But generally, there's less resistance around to yellows than there is for whites. What about the group 3s? So the oldest in the group 3 is the ivermectins. So Ivermec was the first out there. See, that came out in about 1985, 1986. Of our 100 farms, how many do you think we would find some level of resistance to ivermectin on? So we've got an optimistic 20. We've got a pessimistic 70, 50. Yeah, so for ivermectin, it varies a bit, but anywhere from about 50 to about 80%. The other main active in that group is moxidectin, and that's a bit different because it's a longer persistency and also a bit more potent than ivermectin and hasn't been around so long. So if we start looking at moxidectin as separate from ivermectin, where do you think we'll be with resistance to that one? $25s. Yeah. It's quite interesting actually, because that goes anywhere up to 60% of farms you can find resistance to moxidectin on, depending on where you look. And that's partly because people have used the moxidectin injection quite a lot for scab control. And every time we do that, we're inadvertently worming the sheep as well. And if we're using a long-acting injection, then it's the same as repeatedly using that wormer over and over again. So it drives, it's like using it every week for 10 weeks. Okay, so that's the wormers, that's what we've got. And we do know there is resistance out there. So what is resistance? Just as a refresher, it's the heritable ability of the parasite to tolerate a normally effective dose of the wormer. And it's an inevitable consequence of using wormers. It doesn't happen like switching a switch on, it kind of creeps up on us slowly. But every time we worm a sheep, the ones that survive are the ones that produce the next generation of worms. So the more we worm them, the more filtering takes place, and the more often just the resistant ones go back on the pasture. So, we've got to be a bit careful about how we use the wormers to try and reduce this development of resistance. So, a question, with these results, is there any point in using white drenches? Well, yes, there is, but we need to know what we're dealing with and which worm species are there. So we're talking about these different resistance levels, so different studies that were done. The most comprehensive was in Wales, and they found some quite scary numbers. 20% of farms had moxidectin resistance, but over half of them had resistance to 2 or more actives at the same time. So it's definitely out there, and we need to be aware of it. If I asked you guys, not so much have you got resistance on your farm, but do you think your neighbour might have resistance on his farm? What do you think the answer would be? Do you see resistance happening in your area? We've got a few saying yes. Yeah, a few saying yes. We did a survey recently, and we asked quite a lot of, we got a survey company to ask a lot of farmers what they thought. And most farmers thought that the wormers were working fairly well. So, oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way there. Most farmers thought the wormers were working fairly well. So 10 is working as well as they ever did. So, we had majority of farmers are still in this 8, 9, 10 area. And we also asked the farmers, oh, sorry, that shouldn't be there. We also asked the farmers what they based their opinion on. How do you determine if your worming treatment has been effective or not. And most of the farmers are going on look in general condition. So if the lambs look okay after worming, then we think the wormer's effective enough, it's working well enough. And there's an encouraging quarter of the farmers that are using worm egg counts to have a look and be a bit more accurate about it. And the reason we have problems here is because if we go by what the dams look like, we're going to miss resistance developing up to the point where we're losing half the growth rate. So there's enough worms left behind after every treatment to knock off half that growth rate before we can see anything. So it's a bit of an invisible problem that we need to be trying to tackle, which means that really, if we want to know if the wormers are working properly, we have to be doing worm egg counts, because you won't see it any other way. So I've given you lots of bad news. The big question is, what next? What are we going to do about it to firstly keep our wormers working longer, more effectively, and secondly, keep our lambs growing? And that's really something that you need to sort out for your own individual farm, because no two farms are the same. We can talk about the general principles of avoiding the worms, only worming when we need to, and looking after our wormer classes. But really, it's down to trying to get an individual plan to manage the worms on your farm. Right, a couple of questions. Okay, so a couple of questions come up here that we'll just answer quickly. Do I think combination fluke and worm products are responsible for resistance? I think combination fluke and worm products are an easy product to use, but I think we should be using them when we need to treat for worms and fluke at the same time. And that's not always the case. We don't always have to treat for worm and fluke at the same time. So if we do need to, then combinations are a great thing to use. If we're using them when there are no worms there or not enough worms to make a difference, then yes, that does contribute to the development of resistance. And if it means we're using the same active repeatedly for worms, then that too will contribute to the development of resistance. Next question on the box was, can you return to a white wormer after not using it for several years? And unfortunately, the answer to that one is no, you can't. If you've got a worm population that has developed resistance to a point where you're getting treatment failures, so it's not killing enough worms to make any difference, that won't go away. The Modern Research Institute in Edinburgh were one of the first places to confirm they had white drench resistance on their farm, on their research farm. That was in the late 1980s. So they stopped using white wormers and didn't use them again until 2010 or that kind of time. So they didn't use them for about 20 or 30 years. And it didn't really make much difference to the level of resistance in those worms on the farm. So the only way you're going to change that is if you stop keeping sheep on there, so that you stop having sheep worms on that pasture. Once you develop a solidly resistant worm population. It doesn't mean that you can't use white wormers, because we've got to remember that this is different for each worm species. So we know that Nematodiris is pretty much sensitive to BZs. There are very few farms that have any issues with BZs in Nematodiris. So you can still use your white wormers for Nematodiris. There are still some farms where white wormers work for Trichostrongylus and Telur rosacea as well. So depending on what your individual farm resistance profile is. You can use white wormers at certain times of year, but you do need to be finding out which worms are there so that you know when the different wormers are going to be most effective. And we'll come back to the fact that the only way you're going to do that is by doing routine worm egg counts to see when you need to worm in the first place. And then every time you use a wormer, do a check test afterwards to see what's been left behind. And once you get into the habit of doing it, it's a really easy thing to do. You don't have to always gather the sheep in. You can sometimes get samples just picking them up in the pasture while you're out shepherding. So it can actually save you a fair bit of time by doing this. We talked a bit about including all the different groups of wormers. And I didn't say when specifically you should be thinking about the newer groups, so the group 4s and 5s. So we should be trying to use these on, the aim would be every farm once a year for a specific treatment to either reduce the rate of resistance development on your own farm and then for quarantine treatments to stop resistant worms coming in. So that's the 2 times that I would routinely think about using one of the newer wormers. So that's the group 4 orange one, which is Zolvix, and the group 5 dual active, which is StarTect, and that's got the group 5 active in there alongside the group 3 as well. So the next question, we're still on this question, what we're going to do next. I think we've given you lots of questions, and I hope it's made you think about what you're doing and whether you could be doing things differently to give you a better result. What I would like you to think about is having a chat with the vets and working out what you can do to get your worming treatments more effective, time them better, and maybe keep these older generation wormers, the cheaper ones, working for longer so you can keep using them, and also incorporate the newer wormers effectively now so that you don't have to rely on them entirely in the future. Okay, have we got any other questions on what we've covered? A bit random. We've had some good questions there. Was there anything I missed in the chat box, in the question box? I've lost my question box now. Question just popped up there. When would I start egg counts for lambs? So I would think about starting doing egg counts when the lambs are eating enough grass. So mostly that would be when the youngest in the batch is about 3 or 4 weeks old. Now that might coincide with when you're doing your nematovirus treatment, but then you have to keep an eye on the forecast to think about that. So looking at the nematovirus forecast, I'll stick that in the chat box. If you go to the SCOPS website, if you go to that website, you'll see the nematovirus forecast, and it'll tell you what's happening in your area and tell you how to adjust the timings dependent on how your altitude above or below the weather station and whether you're south facing or north facing. So it's really good, really useful. But then when would I start egg counting? I would say once the oldest lamb in the group is about 3 or 4, the youngest lamb in the group is about 3 or 4 weeks old. And then I would be looking at doing it every 3 weeks until we get a good frost or they're fat and gone. Does anybody use the Scops forecast? No. Some have, yeah. So it's one I look at quite a lot just to see what's going on. Okay. Oh, we've got another question come up there. Yeah, it's worth a look if you haven't seen it before. So a question here: if there is no or low risk on the Scops forecast, would you still worm? I wouldn't worm when the youngest lamb is 4 weeks of age. I would be doing a worm egg count just to check and see what's there. Okay, so the only time I would worm without doing a worm egg count is if the Nematodirus forecast was saying, very high risk. Then I would certainly think about doing it. But then I would be doing routine worm egg counts from about that age to see if the other worms were coming along as well. And you might find that you've got other worms there as the Nematodirus hatch happens as well, in which case you might need to do a different wormer treatment. But then the most important one for me is doing that drench check after you've used a wormer, just to see what's left behind. Because if it hasn't killed enough of the worms, then you want to know that the ground they've been on, that's probably quite a high parasite challenge on it. You want to avoid that with your lambs for the rest of the season. And you might want to go back and retreat them with something that's going to be effective. So how often would we take the dung samples? For lambs, if you can do the batch, each mob maybe once every 3 weeks, the more often you do it, the more accurate you're going to be, but the more work it is and the more cost involved. So a happy medium would be doing it every 3 to 4 weeks. If you leave it much longer than 4 weeks, you risk them getting a high burden before you notice. So I would aim for 3 weeks as a kind of happy medium. And we've got to remember that, the worms don't stop when the calendar says it's autumn or winter. They're just looking at what the weather's doing. And last year we had some of the highest worm burdens in November. So the seasons are changing, and we can't relax. We've got to think about, while it's warm enough for the grass to be growing, it's warm enough for the worms to be growing as well. So until we get that really hard frost, I would carry on doing your worm egg counts to see if there's any groups of animals that need a wormer.
I think that's it for questions, is it? Has everyone asked what they need to? If not, you can always contact us later with any further questions if you want. I'd like to say a massive thank you to you, Matt, for presenting this evening. It was really informative, so thank you very much. Our next meeting is on the 20th of May, which is on fertility efficiency. and there will be more cheese and biscuit boxes provided for that as well, if you get your name down. So yeah, just thank you very much, Matt, and if anyone has any further questions or want any more advice, just contact us at the surgery and we'll get back to you. So,
yep, and I'll just have a plug for our website. There's some good information on farm animal health. If you look at farmanimalhealth.co.uk, pretty much everything that I've covered is on the website, with the links to the Scops forecast and a few other good forecasting tools for different diseases if you're interested. Yeah, I'll give that a plug, and if you have any questions, you know where we are.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a nice evening.
Yeah, cheers. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Matt.